Welcome to the CryptoCounsel at Wiley. We are the podcast that decodes the most important disputes in crypto law and regulation. I'm Josh, an international lawyer who does crypto.
And I'm Frank, a finance and technology litigator who also does crypto.
Frank, we have an outstanding guest today. Before we get to that conversation, we have a few quick bits. Are you ready?
Let's do it.
Quick bit number one. Recent headline is that cat-themed coins surge 40%. But perhaps more interestingly for you, Frank, given your love of Dogecoin, it's reported that these cat-themed tokens have emerged as a new cohort alongside dog-themed Dogecoin and Shiba Inu, among the biggest gainers in the cryptocurrency bull run. So my question for you, Frank, is we had dogs, now we have cats. Which animal is next?
Josh, it's hippos. This is not a joke. There's a hippo meme coin. It is called Moo Dang. It is named after a 2-month-old pygmy hippo at a zoo in Thailand, and it is all the rage in meme coin land. So I'm actually in the process of diversifying out of Dogecoin into Moo Dang coin.
Listeners, you heard it here first. It's time for hippo-themed meme coins.
It's all the rage.
Second quick bit is perhaps a little more serious when it comes to regulation and law, is that the government of Ohio is considering again a bill to allow tax payments in cryptocurrency. We've had a guest from El Salvador explaining how the government of El Salvador accepts cryptocurrency tax payments. I suppose my question for you, Frank, is when Ohio, and if Ohio accepts cryptocurrency as a tax payment, will they have limitations, for example, prohibiting certain animal-themed crypto coins?
Yeah, I don't know if they're going to accept the Moo Dang coin. Dogecoin accepted everywhere, universally loved. That is a cool story, Josh, in that it is another example of something you and I just talked about with a trade association group of folks about how the states are actually leading regulating crypto more so than the federal government in the U.S. So it's sort of an interesting illustration of that and reason to stay tuned on what the states are doing in this space.
Absolutely. A lot of interesting experimentation in the states, but the federal government is not standing aside. And that leads to the third quick bit, which is there's a recent reporting last month about the FTC publishing new data on the rise of Bitcoin ATM scams. Frank, what is the role of the FTC in regulating Bitcoin ATMs?
Okay, so we're talking about the Federal Trade Commission?
That's the one in the DC alphabet soup.
Josh, you got me. I am not an FTC lawyer. So do we just stop this episode or what do we do next?
Well, we've covered the SEC, and now we're talking about the FTC. I have good news for you, Frank.
Okay, shoot.
We have a guest with us today.
Oh, we do. Hey, Duane.
Duane Pozza is an expert on the FTC, and we're delighted to have you here, Duane. Tell us a little bit about your background and why you might have some insights about the FTC.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I'm happy to join the podcast. So I was at the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, in the mid-aughts when Bitcoin and blockchain technology were really taking off. I was there until about 2018 and then came over to Wiley from there. Much of my practice now deals with emerging technology regulation, which includes consumer protection matters, FTC matters. That includes as those relate to crypto. So we could talk about this a little bit more, but the FTC actually brought its first Bitcoin-related case in 2014. So it's been a decade now of regulatory enforcement actions. Later on, I led the blockchain working group at the FTC before coming over to Wiley and continuing to work on crypto regulatory matters here.
That's fascinating, and we're so glad you're with us. I'm curious, since you were at the FTC when cryptocurrency is coming on the stage, I think a lot of us here in DC now are seeing a lot of controversy, questions about understanding regulation, but I'm sure it was even more uncertain then. What was it like when the agency is first encountering really a new digital product?
It's a good question. At the beginning, it really was Bitcoin that set off a lot of regulatory attention. And there were a lot of efforts within the agency to understand first Bitcoin, then blockchain as a technology, and then later on Dogecoin, because that was one of the early emerging coins at the time, and actually talk to outside experts in addition to other agencies. The FTC a lot of what they do is bring enforcement actions. And so they are particularly interested in, at the time, understanding what the technology could be used for and how consumers might use it in order to sort of look out at the landscape and see where they might be active. Now, as we know, lots of other agencies also were active starting around the same time. So the FTC only had a piece of it. But the piece of it that the FTC focused on was consumer protection matters. I can talk about those a little more detail.
That's really interesting. We've talked about how the SEC has been controversial by, as some put it, regulating by enforcement. Instead of promulgating regulations through a normal notice and comment rulemaking process, going kind of straight to the enforcement process. Was that part of the debate while you were at FTC?
So it's interesting. The FTC, the way it's positioned with the laws it enforces, doesn't have the same sort of regulatory status questions that the SEC faces. You know, the SEC, as we all know, is dealing with are certain kinds of coins or tokens or products, securities, and that's the hook largely for them to regulate them. The FTC enforces a number of things. One of them is the FTC Act, which applies to unfair or deceptive acts or practices in the marketplace. That is conveniently shorthanded as UDAP. It just rolls off the tongue. But UDAP laws often are primarily focused on deceptive conduct in the marketplace, and they don't depend on necessarily the status of the thing that is involved. So particularly, the FTC will stay away from securities related issues, but they don't have to show that a certain kind of project dealing with crypto is or is not subject to certain kind of test in order to have authority over it.
So the FTC seems to have actually had clear authority for its enforcement actions.
Yeah. So the FTC's first action in 2014, I'll go back there again because it involves Bitcoin mining machines, actually. So back in the day, you could actually buy your own personal Bitcoin mining machine and potentially mine your own Bitcoin. So the first case the FTC brought is against a company called BF Labs, and they claimed that the company was delayed in delivering the machines. And of course, given the pace of Bitcoin and needing more computational power, the delay meant that by the time the machines were delivered, they were essentially worthless. That's what the FTC alleged. That resulted in a settlement, I think, in 2016. But I think is an example of the way that these consumer protection laws get enforced in practice, which was a business arrangement where it was a sale of a product, which was a Bitcoin mining machine. There's no specific sort of jurisdictional hook you need as it relates to this, the fact that it dealt with Bitcoin. It was novel in the sense that, the agency at the time had to understand how Bitcoin worked. And the fact that the machines were essentially worthless, they alleged, by the time they were delivered, was a function of the way Bitcoin worked, right? And because it was in court, there had to be a presentation to a judge who had no idea what Bitcoin was as to how this functioned. So the technology did bear a role on the claims, but from a sort of like, is this the kind of case the FTC brings? The fact it was a new technology made it different, but the legal theory itself tracked a lot of what they would bring against other kinds of business opportunities that they saw as having issues. And again, those are the FTC's allegations. The case ultimately settled.
This is so strange to me, Josh. I mean, usually we talk to people are like, is Bitcoin like an orange or an orange grove? I mean, Duane is just telling us straight up the FTC just does stuff. And I mean, what's up with that?
Well, amazing that at that time when it's such a frontier technology that no one understands, including the judge, that the FTC has a role really in defining what it is in the market so that there are not UDAPs, unfair practices. But the market is more developed now. It's been 10 years since it sounds like that first enforcement action was brought. Is the FTC still as involved, as critical in the development of this market? How do you see this in your practice?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, there's just a huge amount of attention, as you guys have discussed, about where the SEC is headed and what it's doing around the regulation of crypto and whether or not it's a security. And that is the big issue in the room. And there are plenty of securities lawyers who could talk more about that. But I think that behind that, regardless of which way it goes on the securities question, these consumer protection laws are essentially a sort of backstop so that other kinds of regulators who have similar authorities, and here I look at like states as a key element here, state attorney generals, who have similar kinds of statutes they enforce. And then also even private litigants who can enforce often state laws that have similar private rights of action can potentially bring disputes or look to see whether or not they think there are issues, putting aside the regulatory status of a lot of these projects. And I think that's important to realize because for folks who are active in the space, there are all these gating questions around securities, obviously. But then there are other sorts of questions from financial services regulations, if you're in that space, to basic consumer protection compliance, to just having sort of core dispute resolution issues that can result in lots of other potential legal issues if they're not sort of handled well. And the companies have been around the space in the ensuing decade, have paid attention to those and handled those separate from this other issue of securities that I think often gets a lot of really the media attention of regulation in the space.
So are you seeing in today's environment some trends, some enforcement trends from the FTC or some of those state analogs that you mentioned?
Sure. I think there's a big concern with fraud. You mentioned the FTC's recent admonition about Bitcoin ATM fraud as an example. But I take a step back and say an agency like the FTC and many other ones are concerned about fraud in the marketplace generally. And they have been, I think, looking pretty closely at fraud when it has any element of crypto involved. Now, often the kinds of fraud they see in the marketplace are, I would say, traditional types of fraud. They just have a crypto element on top of, pay me in crypto or something like that. And those can get lumped together in these like reports around sort of, crypto fraud, as they put it. So I think that is a big focus for the FTC or for states or other agencies. And I think it really drives home that companies operating in this area have to pay close attention to their fraud controls. Now, this is nothing new. For example, financial services firms, right, who have all kinds of requirements to do things like proactively monitor for and suss out fraud. So that's not a sort of new requirement. But I think the focus on crypto I think agencies like the FTC are particularly focused when there's a crypto element and they see something involving fraud in the marketplace.
So I definitely get the financial services, the level of comfort around sort of embracing something new that they're already heavily regulated. They have a function internally that's used to dealing with this. Are there some sort of examples or industries where you're seeing it's hard for them to catch up to where this is and where crypto is causing problems and the newness of it from a fraud enforcement perspective, like any just sort of ones that pop to mind?
So companies that are consumer facing, and that includes dealing with consumers in ways that might involve crypto, should pay close attention to feedback they're getting from consumers. Like I always tell folks, listen closely to consumer complaints because they often will signal where regulators might poke under the hood and potential issues that you might have down the line. And I think that's even more critical when you're dealing with issues like crypto because consumers' level of understanding might differ depending on what kind of crypto project you're talking about. And it's important to listen and hear what they're saying to understand how they're dealing with your product.
One interesting example, we've mentioned ATMs a couple times, but just to make this incredibly concrete, you're walking down the street, you come across two ATMs. One is a big US bank. You can put in your card and get your cash out. The other one is a Bitcoin ATM. Which one are consumers more comfortable with and which one are regulators more concerned with?
That's a good question. We should do a survey. Email us. What's interesting is that one of them is subject to different kinds of regulations than the other. So, this goes back to the alphabet soup. If your bank ATM is regulated by a bank regulatory institution, they have their own rules. And a Bitcoin ATM could be subject to different rules.
What about a Dogecoin ATM?
I haven't seen one of those yet, but I think we'll have to see what consumers think about those.
You get the maximum protection with the Mojdang coin ATM. That's where you have the most level of banking assurance.
I'm going to predict it right here. The first Dogecoin ATM will be on Mars when Elon Musk takes it there.
Right, accepting literal Dogecoin.
Yeah.
So Duane, obviously Josh and I, CryptoCounsel, we're mostly disputes focused. We're litigators, arbitrators. To the extent these problems in your practice bubble up into disputes, what does that look like for you?
So I think one key dispute that you see is representations that can straddle the line between aggressive marketing or hype and overpromising. So again, taking a look at sort of FTC or UDAP compliance at large, a lot of it is around marketing of certain kinds of products or services. And crypto is not immune to having certain areas of hype where folks are promoting the benefits of a new technology.
Our favorite example is Matt Damon in a Super Bowl ad on fortune favoring the braid.
Yeah, we've invited Matt Damon to the podcast. He has repeatedly declined. So if you have any pull or in with him, we would appreciate it.
Yeah. So what's interesting is in all those situations, you always have to look at what representations are being made. Sometimes there aren't specific representations being made or about what a specific product or service can do. But to the extent that they can be heavily scrutinized. Again, this is not unique to crypto. And I think lots of new technologies often have this issue of trying to describe it the way it works to consumers in a way they'll understand and convey the benefit, but without saying something that goes beyond what can actually promise. And I think that is an area where you see a lot of scrutiny, and you can certainly see disputes arising to the extent that the counterparty doesn't think it's performing the way that it has been advertised or marketed.
And I'm curious, I mean, we've been talking about sort of crypto as the means of a currency, also a potential security, although obviously a lot of debate about that. But blockchain, the technology that undergirds all of this, does that piece of it, which is now increasingly sort of a back end part of a lot of products, is that coming up into your view and getting some of the scrutiny as well?
Yeah, I think that there's always been a question of what are all the benefits of blockchain. They're mostly more on the sort of business to business or enterprise level as opposed to consumer facing, here's what blockchain will do for you. But I do think that it underlies a lot of what's going on with companies that are innovating in crypto and trying to turn that technology into a consumer facing product that consumers can use.
So last question just on disputes, and we'll turn to a slightly different topic, which is, do you see any sort of areas where disputes are likely to arise? Like they're not quite, there, but going forward, things that clients and companies should be on the lookout for in this space?
Well, I think sometimes in crypto, you feel like you might be fighting the last battle, particularly on the regulatory front. And so I don't really have a crystal ball as to where the disputes are headed. But I think as the technology evolves, and there's all these new and exciting use cases that go out into the market, you're going to see the potential for there to be disputes, as there always are in commercial arrangements. But I think also it's important for companies not just to be fighting the last battle, but thinking about, okay, putting aside these important regulatory issues, but thinking about bringing a product to market, what are these other sets of issues that I need to watch out for to make sure that, everything is buttoned up on the compliance side in advance, and to try to avoid these disputes if possible.
Obviously, in a perfect world, these companies are avoiding any kind of dispute, but this is America, this is crypto. Companies are probably going to lean forward with their marketing. And if they're doing that, they're potentially have some exposure to deceptive trade practices, even if they think that this marketing is fine. Do you think it's more of a concern to face private litigants bringing claims or regulatory action by an agency such as the FTC?
Yeah, interesting question. You're right. It's not a perfect world. I think they're both pretty big risks. Obviously, the regulatory risk is high because an agency like the FTC or a state attorney general can launch an investigation. And even if they ultimately conclude that there was no line crossed or they're not going to bring an action, that can be very costly and disruptive to a business. And it's important to be able to handle that in a way that minimizes the disruption and the possibility of there being an additional action. On the private litigation side, as you guys know, the class action risk is always a huge issue. As I mentioned, these UDAP laws often have state law analogs with private rights of action. And so that can be a pretty big risk if there are issues there and class plaintiffs can find a hook.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and it's sort of rare for us to speak to people that have been with this industry since the early days. And so I'm just interested to hear from you, Duane, a way in which you think legal professionals are sort of just fundamentally still thinking about this industry in a wrong way.
Yeah, one important thing I think is to not get bogged down into the details of the technology when trying to spot the bigger picture legal issues, because the technology itself is fascinating. Folks in this area get into it in large part because the technology is so interesting. And I think that it's important then to abstract away, as we're doing in this discussion, and you guys always do, what are the bigger picture trends and issues? I think back to, again, that first case 10 years ago, getting into the details of how Bitcoin worked to a judge in 2014 it's not going to be overall too illuminating in terms of explaining whatever the issues were. There had to be sort of a bigger picture view of what the sort of legal issues were arising in the case, and then explanation of the technology followed. So I think actually, even though it's fun to get into the nitty gritty of the details of blockchain, and I always enjoy reading up on it, taking a bigger picture view can be pretty critical.
It's funny because you and I had a lunch recently where this concept came up, and a person in the industry was saying they were with an older member of Congress, and the member wanted to understand the technology and was insisting on being shown Bitcoin from the person's wallet, and it killed the conversation.
Here's the $20 bill. I understand this. Now show me the Bitcoin.
Yeah, it was a complete showstopper in terms of trying to get through and say, well, actually, I mean, the technology piece, the failure to sort of have that ability to connect on that basic level made it a very hard conversation. So you saying that just sort of reminded me of that. And I totally agree. So on the flip side, what's one thing you think that legal professionals just are not paying enough attention to in this space?
I think an important thing to think about is what's going to happen next. Again, in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, this could look totally different, right? Bitcoin mining machines are going to keep evolving. That there's going to be all kinds of interesting new use cases. There'll be some hippo coins. There'll be a lot more that's developing. So I think it's fun to think creatively about what's going to come next. And again, sort of also not focus on just fighting the last fight or the current fight. Not that those are not important, but I think a lot of the fun in this area is thinking about what could come next and problem solve for that.
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't let Josh ask a question about what's happening internationally, because he loves everything happening internationally. So Josh, you want to do an international question for Duane, and then maybe we'll close up shop here?
Absolutely. So we've talked a little bit about the turf battles internally between agencies, who has responsibility over this or that. There's consumer protection. But a lot of companies right now are trying to avoid the United States because there's this uncertainty. To the extent the technology is moving forward and innovating, a lot of that's starting to deliberately avoid the U.S. market. First question is, to what extent should companies operating outside the United States, or at least trying to, be concerned about regulatory actions by the FTC or others? Do they have extraterritorial reach?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, generally, if U.S. consumers are involved, certainly the FTC takes the position that it can go after companies if they think there's consumer harm. As a practical matter, a lot of the enforcement actions are based on companies with the U.S. presence, but not always. The FTC has certainly gone after companies that have U.S. consumers, even if they are headquartered abroad. And the other piece I'll say is, particularly around areas like crypto, there is coordination between different kinds of enforcers and their counterparts in different countries, particularly European countries. So it's not a case where the US is, particularly on consumer protection, acting without a coordination. So I do think really the touchstone is it affecting US consumers.
And it sounds like as long as a company has US consumers, which it's hard to avoid, they need to pay some attention to what's going on in the US regulatory market.
Yeah, absolutely. And the states. I always say keep an eye on the states. It only takes one or two of them to start really wading into this stuff. They can make a pretty big impact.
All right. Well, this has been incredibly helpful, Duane. I feel like I know a lot more about the FTC and what to do and not to do. I mean, Matt Damon tells us fortune favors the bold. Also, apparently, got to be thinking about this stuff in a proactive way, worrying about your hippo coins, checking all the boxes, being creative. But really appreciate the conversation. Josh, anything else before we let Duane go?
I think we should give him an opportunity to provide the final word, and there's no requirement to address hippo coins in that.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. I greatly enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks, Duane.